Well, first, let me say how honored I am to be have been invited to talk by Taco to talk with the Dallas group, and how sheepish I am, maybe deer in the headlights I am, talking about Dallas art to a Dallas group. All I can say is be patient and please be kind. The graphic here that I'm beginning with, showing Dallas and Houston both in the 1930s, I put in to emphasize how close we are, because what I'm going to be talking about through most of my talk today is how far apart we were in some respects in the 1930s when it came to art. Over the years here in Houston, a number of us have done a number of exhibitions that focus on Houston art. These are catalogs from those exhibitions. We've been lucky enough that we've been able to publish catalogs for them. So as we were looking in 2019 at another exhibition idea, we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could to broaden the context? The last show we did looked at Houston in relation to Mexico as well as Houston itself. And so we thought, well, let's look for another one that broadens out things. And so as we were casting around for ideas, it struck me that there was a very interesting parallel that was going on in Houston and Dallas in the 1930s, in which a group of younger artists in both cities with their older mentors were grappling with the new ideas of modernism that were sweeping across the country. That was the case that people were grappling with those ideas in lots of places, so it wasn't just in Houston and Dallas. But what I realized was that what the solution or the outcomes from that experience in the two cities of Houston and Dallas, even though close together, were in many ways completely different. The groups that I'm talking about are the Cherry-McNeill Group here in Houston. And you're seeing, and in each case, I'm sort of looking at a three-generation configuration. Three-generation configuration, starting with the sort of the progenitor of art in both cities.
Look at this.
The middle
Or no.
What?
Going through a middle.
Everybody needs to mute themselves.
Yeah, if you're not mute already, go ahead and mute your computer.
Yes, please mute.
Going through a middle generation in each city, and then to those younger artists who were really becoming active in the late 30s and late 20s and the 30s. So in Houston, it's the Cherry, and y'all will probably not be familiar with very many, if any, of these names, aside from Mrs. Cherry, perhaps. In Dallas, of course, it was the Dallas 9 group. And one obvious difference I think you can see right away in the two groups is that in Dallas, it was all men. And in Houston, it was a diverse group of women, especially the progenitor generations were women, and then men. Now, it's not as obvious from the picture, in fact, it's not obvious at all, that in Houston also, several of the men were gay. The women were all women, as far as we know, but some of them even were lesbian. So that's I hope to be able to get to have time at the end to talk about that as another crucial difference in terms of the art outcomes in the two cities. But the exhibition we were going to do in 2020, of course, got swept away. We hope we're going to be able to do it in 2022, but since no one has been able to see it yet, I want to start with a series of the sort of the juxtapositions that we might have been able to do, not necessarily specific paintings I'll be showing, but showing art made in Houston and in Dallas roughly the same time. I'm not saying there's any relationship between the paintings, except that they're roughly the same time, somewhat similar subject matter or technique or look. So I'll start with these two men who were in many ways sort of the seminal figures in especially the younger generation in each city, who I'm sure almost none of you have heard of up in Dallas, and Jerry Bywaters, who all of you have heard of. And so, I just start with these two paintings that were done at a similar time, but in some respects, visually epitomize the differences in the two cities. Here we've got, going back to that first generation, Mrs. Cherry, painting in 1919, and Frank Ray, painting in 1920. Ola Mcneil Davidson, who is represented here on the left by the painting that, if anybody knows her, this is the painting they know. It's the painting that's been out there in many exhibitions. And Alexander Hogue, of course, on the right. Naomi Carlson, again, someone you probably have not heard of, on the left, and Everett Spruce on the right. Frank Leshkara and William Lester. Carden Bailey and Jerry Bywaters. Robert Prusser and Everett Spruce. Now, you may well have heard of Prusser. He's the one of the Houston group who of the younger group who actually has been shown. In fact, a couple of 3 years ago, his work was being shown in the Dallas Museum of Art and the Amon Carter at the same time. And I looked it up before we came on today and found that the last time he was shown in one of the major Houston museums was 1956. So thank y'all for showing our Houston artist Prusser. Dean Lee and Charles Bowling. Forrest Bess, who's another artist you may have heard of. He was not part of the Cherry-McNeill Group in terms of being a student, but he was associated with them in terms of exhibitions and work. And Otis Dozier. So I think you can see from those juxtapositions that there was really a major difference in the way that modernism was being assimilated in the two cities. Now, I want to, in two statements, this sort of epitomizes that difference. Mrs. Cherry, writing in 1920, modernists teach that painting is scientific from its very elements. Jerry Bywaters, writing in 1928, art, to be significant, must be a reflection of life. It must be a part of a people's thought. Two very different approaches to what painting was, what painting should embody, and what made it significant, what made it relevant to people. And that's the sort of the difference that was happening in the two cities for a number of reasons. One of which was of course a different feeling about where one looked for precedents in Houston. Thanks to Mrs. Cherry, I think Houston people were much more willing to look to European precedents. Jerry Bywaters explicitly rejected European precedents in terms of finding an American art. Now, they were people in a visual way, I think, that sort of epitomizes the difference with two images. And this is Mrs. Cherry's Cubist study on the left, and of course, Alexander Hogue's fantastic Erosion #2 on the right, both dealing with male forms. The colors are similar, but the purposes of the artists in many ways could not have been more different in creating these works. Now, it's interesting in a way that the two cities diverged so, because their beginnings were very much the same. Now, when I sent my notice out about to the HETAG list about the upcoming meeting and had Mr. Ray's picture in the slide, I almost instantaneously got an email back from Michael Grauer chiding me for linking Mr. Ray in any way with modernism. So I had to say to him that I was doing it really only to indicate that there was this original common origin for the two cities, and also to highlight the fact that Mr. Ray was rejected in a way by the later generations, that young generation of Dallas artists, in a way that Mrs. Cherry was not rejected. You can speculate about why that was the case, but it's an interesting phenomenon that the two had different fates in terms of their own cities and their acceptance. They both, however, were in Paris at the same time in 1888, 89, studying at the Académie Julian. They both were learning Impressionism there. They wouldn't have known each other. Mrs. Cherry wasn't a Texas artist quite then. It was a few years before she got to Texas, and also the classes for men and women were distinct. But the origin, in terms of the two artists and their original training, was the same, and so that the heirs basically should have gone in such different directions is, I think, very interesting. Part of the reason for that is, of course, Jerry Bywaters he's the person in the Dallas group who really articulated the thrust of importance in art in a way that I think set the course in many. He wasn't alone in developing the art, but he was the one who was the writer. And he drew his inspiration not from Europe, not from New York, but from Mexico. Where he went in 1928 to look at the fabulous murals that Diego Rivera was painting. Just before the pandemic, we were lucky enough to be in Mexico City, so we went to the Secretariat of Education to see the murals that Bywaters saw shortly after they were painted in 1928 with Diego Rivera. While we were there, I noticed this painted motto at the top of one, and a friend of mine translated it for me since I don't speak Spanish. And her translation was, the true civilization will be the harmony of men with the earth and of men with each other. And I think that when Bywaters saw that, he probably thought, yeah, that's what art is about. For whatever reason, he was very impressed with what Diego Rivera and the other muralists in Mexico were doing in terms of bringing the life and culture of Mexico into their art. Now, he didn't want to remember or didn't want to acknowledge that Diego Rivera had actually been as much a Parisian Cubist as Picasso and Braque in the early days before he came back to Mexico at the end of the revolution. In fact, while he was in Mexico, while he was in Paris, Rivera's companion at the time, and actually the mother of one of his children, talks about how she met all of the important Parisian artists of the time in Rivera's studio, and she has painted this painting in homage to him, which includes Rivera over here, in homage to the artist she met. But anyway, when he came back to Mexico, for political but also for artistic reasons, he began to see that the importance of art was incorporating it, the indigenous culture, and spreading that to the indigenous population. And that's what Bywaters found so compelling about Diego Rivera, as he spelled out in this Southwest Review article, which he wrote after he got back from his trip to Mexico. So Bywaters and the other Dallas artists were looking to Mexico for their inspiration rather than Europe and New York. They also were looking to regionalists in the Midwest for their inspiration, people like Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. And so the art that they created with that inspiration, looking to those Midwestern regionalists, of course, drew on the same themes that the Midwestern regionalists were painting in their art. And Florence McClung here on the left, of course, was not one of the original Dallas Nine, but the Nine grew and contracted and changed names. And so she obviously is a part of that movement in Dallas. And so the art wound up looking similar in many respects, and certainly drawing on the same themes as their inspirations, as is the case with the Houston group. But unlike the Dallas group, the Houston group, sort of epitomized by Jean Charlton, who stands in that same sort of position as Bywaters did, but for the Houston group, drew on the inspirations that they saw as important. Charlton, for instance, spent the better part of 4 years in New York from 1930 to 1934, studying stage design and interior decoration. So things that might not really be considered significant art, certainly when you're looking at Mexican muralism, but that's where his specific training was happening in that period. And he was assimilating the art that he was seeing around him in New York, such artists as, for instance, John Marin, who's on the right. This is the Charlton painting on the left of Manhattan, drawing on his time there, but also drawing on the inspiration he saw in the work of Marin, which he was learning from. And because the Houston group was looking, in fact, embracing an international modernism, not a specifically American modernism, American generated modernism, and looking to Europe and looking to New York, these are the sorts of paintings that could be produced by the Houston artists, drawing on their European precedents. For instance, Ola Mcneil Davidson drawing, perhaps not explicitly, but but on the same spirit as Redon and Charlton, drawing on such inspirations as Kandinsky. This Charlton on the right here, by the way, a fabulous painting, came out of a Fort Worth estate sale not very many years ago. I wish I had been in Fort Worth that day for sure. Now, to be sure, Jerry Bywaters didn't just go to Mexico. In fact, he went to New York, he went to Europe. Before he went to Mexico, in fact, he went in 1927, but he didn't find what he saw there to his liking, as he made quite clear in a series of articles that he did, travelogue articles that he did for the Dallas Morning News, and that he illustrated also, pardon me, these are his own illustrations for the articles. In New York, for instance, he was dismayed that he didn't find anyone who spoke, he found lots of people who spoke colloquial Pekingese, but nobody who spoke colloquial Texan, which was a difficulty in his navigating. And in Spain, apparently, literally, people were stepping on his toes. I'm not sure, it doesn't seem in the article to spell that out, but anyway, I think he's just making the point that those were not the places he was going to find his inspiration. Pardon me. Now, which modernism is better? Well, you know, as I say here, opinions differ. Interestingly enough, at the time, considering now that in many ways Texas regionalism is considered the Texas art. When people think of Texas art or earlier Texas art, that's what they think of. It was much easier to see Houston art in Dallas than it was to see Dallas art in Houston. In part, that was because of the State Fair exhibitions that were going on. But also it was because there was a gallerist here in Houston named Samuel Yunt, who made a real concerted effort to take Houston art to Dallas. And he did several exhibitions, not of the people that we'll be talking about, but Grace Spalding John and Ruth Pershing Mueller and others. There had been a Hogue exhibition in Houston at the museum in 1929. But until, thank you. Before 1940, there were a couple of Dallas print exhibitions in the late 30s of the men artists. I don't know when the women's print group got started, but this was the men's group. But aside from that, the first Jerry Bywaters painting that I've been able to document as being shown in Houston was his The Mountains Meet the Sea in 1940. And it was here only because the Texas General had started at that point, and that was a show that went around to the various cities of Texas. And so that brought his painting here and the painting of other Dallas 9 artists. And so it was sort of mind-boggling to me to think that that was the case, that even though Bywaters had been a jurist for the local exhibition, juried exhibitions that the museum had every year, and he had been here to speak, there was no effort to show the paintings of the Dallas 9 in Houston. And I just throw that out there because it did shock me when I realized that. Now, which is better? Hard to say. Jerry Bywaters expressed his opinion in 1935 when the Allied show had happened in Dallas, and similar shows from Houston and Fort Worth went to Dallas. So there was a possibility to compare them there on the ground in Dallas. He doesn't say much about the Fort Worth show, but he does mention a little more extensively the Houston show. And he says at the risk of being impolite, he concludes that the Dallas show is better, not surprisingly. Now, the only thing that he really says about it is that there were 158 items in it, which was twice as many as the Houston show. So, but of course it's Texas, so bigger is always better, I guess. But anyway, I won't upbraid him too much for finding his own hometown art the best of the three. Now, the Dallas group, of course, is very well documented. These are some of the premier publications that talk about the Dallas 9 and their art and its impact in Dallas, but also elsewhere. I could not presume to add to this scholarship, certainly not before a Dallas audience, and certainly not before an audience that includes authors of several of these works. So all I will say is that to find out more about the Dallas Nine, if you need to find out or want to find out more, we all need to, but if you want to, look to these works. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my talk, this was sort of a bait and switch in a way, I'm going to introduce you more fully to the Houston people, because they're the people that you likely have not heard much, if anything, about. So that's this group, with Mrs. Cherry as the standing in the grandparent position. Be talking much about her because I've talked about her a great deal, and there is a good deal in print about her too, including there will be a chapter about her in the upcoming Cassetta book of women artists. Ola Mcneil Davidson, who's in the middle generation, who was Mrs. Cherry's student, but was a painter herself, and a lifelong friend of Mrs. Cherry, and they had the highest regard for each other. And then a group of people who were, who were either students of Ola Mcneil Davidson or who worked closely with Ola Mcneil Davidson. Now, I won't be talking too much about the Dallas artists, but I will be pointing out some relevant Dallas connections to the Houston scene as we go along. And first, I guess I should explain how the Cherry-McNeill Group got its name. Now, I thank Ellen for pointing me to an Art Digest article from 1932, which seems to be the source of the Dallas Nine as a name for the group that talks about the nine and artists in Dallas. I was floundering as I did my own search to find out, because when I searched Dallas Nine in the Dallas Morning News, I got lots of articles about football, which at first I didn't quite understand. And then I realized, oh yeah, there are 9 people on a football team, aren't there? So, but Alan pointed out to me that an article that talked about the 1932 show in which the original nine were featured, young artists were featured, talks about the nine. And that seems, it's an anonymous article as far as I can tell. That seems to be the source of the name Dallas Nine. The Cherry-McNeill Group got its name much later. In 1950, Ola Mcneil Davidson was responding to a letter from Mrs. Cherry. Mrs. Cherry was over 90 at that point. Was feeling a little bit left out of the Houston art scene, I think. And so she was, we don't have her letter. It's not clear exactly what she said, but she seemed to be saying that it had all been for naught. And McNeil Davidson assures her that that was not the case, that the Cherry-McNeill Group was having profound impacts, and that Mrs. Cherry was in fact the biggest link of that group, because without her, the work that was being done by people like Robert Cruiser, Carden Bailey, Jean Charlton, and others would not have been possible. And so that's where the Cherry-McNeill Group got its name. Ola Mcneil Davidson, as I said, is known primarily by that one fabulous painting. And has not gotten a lot of credit, not nearly as much as she deserves, I think. She'll be mentioned at some length in the Cassetta book on women artists. But even in 1936, when Alexander Hogue was writing in the Art Digest, it was the Texas Centennial issue, and he was looking at art around the state of Texas. He sort of dismisses her in what seems to be a somewhat sexist way, but of course sexism, we don't, he would not necessarily have been aware of that in 1936, but he refers to her as herself an artist, because from his point of view, her most important contribution was that she was a teacher of Carden Bailey and Jean Charlton, who were the hot young things in Houston at that time. Pardon me. Now, maybe he also misspelled her name in what was probably her only mention in a national publication, which was a bit unfortunate. I'm sure that was completely unconscious, or maybe not, because maybe he was responding to the Houston Post article when he was a juror down here in Houston, referring to him as Mrs. Alexander Hogue. Surely he wouldn't have remembered that, however. And after all, James Gilman did say, and it was true, that in art, Houston was a woman's affair, which is one of the characteristics of Houston in the early days, as opposed to Dallas for sure, and many other cities. As I said, Mrs. Cherry, who's here on the right, in the 40s, and Ola Mcneil Davidson were lifelong friends. Pardon me. And Davidson had a colorful career as an artist. This is a wonderful photograph from the Dallas Morning News showing Davidson Ruth Pershing Euler and a woman named Mary Ellen Butte, who went on to be one of the first avant-garde filmmakers in the country, on a trip to West Texas, or the Panhandle, where Davidson's family had ranches. And they did a painting tour in the 20s, and they were certainly done up for the event. And also it talks about the number of rattlesnakes they had to kill, and how Miss Butte was good at skinning and tanning them. I just love that photograph. Can't quite make out what the paintings are, and as far as I know, none of those paintings are known now. Their location is known, which is a real problem for Ola Mcneil Davidson and others in this group, because since they haven't been given much credit over the decades and so haven't been collected, many of their works, even the fabulous works like the one that was found in Fort Worth in that estate sale, are not known. The locations are not known. McNeill Davidson did lots of work. We know that she did. Some of it exists, the painting on the right, but also this much earlier painting called Edge of Wood from the mid-1920s. The painting on the left, which was bought out of the David Dyke auction a few years ago by George W. and Laura Bush. Her wonderful Canis painting, which is now in the collection at Panhandle Plains Museum. These paintings, the one on the left is actually in a Chicago collection, Bayou scene. So I've never seen it in person. Would love to. The two paintings on the right were from Mrs. Cherry's estate. And in fact, this lower right one is one of Mrs. Cherry's greyhounds. She was a great dog lover, especially greyhounds. Pardon me. But many of Ola Mcneil Davidson's best paintings, the ones that were most spectacular, are gone. Don't know whether family has them in closets or where they might be, but the one on the left it no longer exists, but it was the birdhouse in the park. And this is a wonderful construction made by I'm not going to remember his name, the fabulous faux bois artist from San Antonio. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now. I'm told that it no longer exists, that it's actually perhaps underneath the concrete structure that was put on to encase it. And on the right is what must have been a wonderful painting, haunting, and sort of people loved to hate it apparently when it was first shown. This painting, however, which is sort of an essence of, in many ways, of her work, because it has such a mystical take on what the landscape is about. She had sort of metaphysical, not religious leanings, but really metaphysical leanings. And a lot of that showed up in much of her work. And I just love this Church of God as the name of this painting. And its location is known. We've actually been lucky enough to borrow that for an exhibition in the past. Now, in defense of Alexander Hoag, perhaps her most important contribution was not her art as much as her teaching, because she was apparently a fabulous teacher and a liberating teacher who didn't tell her students what they should do, but told them that they should do what they needed to do. And that's epitomized, I think, in this wonderful sort of expressions, self-portrait and portrait, because it's called Watching Mcneil. This is Mcneil Davidson painting. And this figure here on the left is actually Robert Cruiser, who turned out to be her star pupil when he was about 15 years old. Two of her other star pupils, in fact, the ones that Alexander Hoag said were the most interesting and significant painters in Houston at the time, were Carden Bailey and Jean Charlton, who are shown here in a photograph on the left of Carden Bailey and a self-portrait, pencil portrait of Jean Charlton. And they were sort of an older generation. Cruiser was much younger than them, even though they were all studying with Mcneil Davidson at the same time in the 30s. These men were going on 10 years older than Cruiser, so they were a much older and more mature generation. And they were not only painting partners throughout the 30s and into the later 40s, they were also life partners. And here's a wonderful photograph from the paper as they were getting ready to go on a trip to Europe with Mcneil Davidson and her son. Charlton painted 100 watercolors to sell to finance the trip, because they were starving artists. They didn't have any money and wanted to go to Europe. And so here's Carden Bailey advising Charlton on one of his paintings, which I've blown up here, just to show it next to a John Marin painting to reinforce that sort of inspiration that Charlton was drawing on. These are more Charlton paintings from the mid-30s, wonderful expressionist paintings, because German expressionism became very significant to these Houston artists. And Charlton, he did it very well. I showed that comparison before of a Kandinsky, and I don't know explicitly that he was looking at Kandinsky as he devised these paintings, but he did the expressionist approach to the world very, very well. But he also was an early abstractionist, and keep in mind this is the mid-30s. Abstraction in the United States, and certainly in Houston, it would have been not just a new thing, but almost unheard of thing. And so he was known at that point as Houston's abstract painter, which means, of course, that he was Texas' abstract painter at that point. And these three wonderful little oils, they're small, they're not, abstract expressionist scale paintings, have only recently come to my attention. The owner of them knew that they were wonderful, but I only found out about them recently. These two watercolors, which are also from that same period, also came from Fort Worth. So up there may be a treasure trove of Jean Charlton work. Carden Bailey at that period was an active and very successful painter of portraits. In fact, Mrs. Cherry painted portraits, and there were other portrait painters around, but Carden Bailey sort of became the society portrait painter, especially of children. And this upper left portrait is a wonderful portrait of McNeill Davidson's grandson, which Carden Bailey did, and other Houstonians, including some people who still are with us, and actually still look very much like the paintings, only of course a few years older. But one that I want to point out is the one here at the bottom, which is a portrait of Jerry Harwell. And this is one of those Dallas connections, because Harwell at this point in the late 30s was in Houston writing for the Post. I believe it was the Post, one of the papers, but I'm pretty sure it was the Post, and was part of the group that Jean Charlton and Carden Bailey were involved in. And this is his portrait by Carden Bailey, and of course a later picture of him. He was the curator at the Dallas Art Museum for years in the late 40s and early 50s. He was from Fort Worth, came to Houston, then went back up to North Texas, and left, I think, to go back to Fort Worth in the early 50s. But that's another one of the Dallas connections. Carden Bailey didn't just do portraits, however. He did a number of other things, many inspired by ballet and music. And ballet was a very important element of the art world here in Houston at that point, for reasons which if I have time, I'll talk about later on. But also music was something that all of these artists were very concerned with in terms of a relationship between music and their art. The painting on the left is an orchestra scene that Carden Bailey did in 1940, which was, I'm pretty sure, inspired by this painting on the right, which is a Dufy, part of a Dufy mural that he would have seen in 1937 on the trip that he and Charlton and McNeill Davidson had to Paris. And I think he's probably pretty clearly drawing on what he saw in that Dufy mural. Another of the Dallas connections, in a way, and one of the most fascinating of this whole group, is Naomi Carlson. The Dallas connection is that she grew up in Jefferson, and as her first step in her move away from Jefferson, went to Dallas and did some art training there. But she pretty quickly made it down to Houston in the mid-30s, and spent the rest of her life here in Houston. She was, to my way of thinking, a really an amazingly unique eye. And I've put these paintings together just to show how her take on a sort of a regionalist landscape, though it's a regionalist landscape after a tornado's gone through almost, but how that compares to the famous regionalist landscape painters Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton, and the famous, not quite yet abstract expressionist painter Jackson Pollock, who was a student of Thomas Hart Benton, of course, in those days. And this is Naomi Carlson here on the lower right. And I mean, it's amazing to me that her painting stands up so well against paintings by people who are actually well-known and famous. This is another image of the one we just saw, but others of her regionalist inflected landscape paintings. There are very few of her works around. She was a woman who, she didn't have to make a living, but she did have to make her way in a world in which something a woman artist, but also a woman artist who was doing strange things, was not really well received. And so she didn't produce an awful lot, though. After the Second World War, she produced a completely different looking group of paintings that wound up getting a one-woman show in New York. But she's someone to keep an eye out for, because she is really amazingly unique. You look at a lot of art and you say, oh, that's great. And it reminds me of, I look at these and it's hard for me to think of who that would remind me of. Robert Pruser, of course, is the one of this group who you may well have Texas, more of his work than we've been able to see here in Houston, unfortunately, in our museums. He was in that younger generation, about 10 years younger. And at this point in his career, he was learning and absorbing from these older people, not just his contemporary or slightly older contemporaries, but from his teacher, McNeill Davidson. These two paintings, when I saw they were in the same collection at one point, and when I saw them, it's like, oh my God, I see where he's coming from in going from this to that. And even from Mrs. Cherry, this is one of Mrs. Cherry's mid-1920s Cubist paintings, which, as far as I can tell, were the first Cubist paintings by a Texas artist, and the first Cubist paintings actually to be in Texas when she brought them back. She would have had those available for these people to look at. And I think Pruser may have looked at that when he did this composition for his much different painting, but it just looks to me like it's too similar to be, for a young artist, to be an accident. And when he painted this, he was 19 years old, this painting on the left. And here he is, I think, looking at the things he was seeing that Jean Charlton, who was an older artist to look up to, was doing. When he painted this, again, this one, he was only 17 when he painted it. Frank de Leshkara, who was a classmate of Pruser's in the high school they went to, and it was Regan High School, Reagan, I'm not sure exactly, I think it's Regan High School is the way they pronounce it, had an amazing art teacher, apparently, because it was Pruser came out of that program, Frank de Leshkara came out of that program, someone we'll see in a minute named Dean Lee came out of that program. And, you know, they were able to produce works like this as teenagers here in Houston. This one on the upper left, this is a picture of de Leshkara taken in a gallery that McNeill Davidson and these students opened in 1938 briefly. It was only about a year that was open, specifically to show abstract art that was made in Houston. They did have other exhibitions. Will Stevens from New Orleans had a show of his abstract work. He was a friend of Davidson's. She had studied with him. And then they had exhibitions of German expressionist prints that were touring the country. But this is a picture of de Leshkara in the gallery with these two paintings. This one, which is, he calls a self-portrait. And on the upper right here is a long description that he wrote on the back of the painting when he gave it to some friends in 1974, explaining how the reason it's so beat up is because nobody bought it in 1938 when he painted it. So he had it hanging around, and he had to cover a hole in the tool shed. So he used the painting to cover the hole in the tool shed, and pried it off the wall and gave it to the friends. The one on the lower left is actually has a similar inscription on the back when he gave it to Richard Stout in the 70s. Now, Forrest Bess is another artist that you probably have heard of because he has achieved some acclaim. And he, as I said, he wasn't a student of McNeill Davidson, but he came to Houston in the late 1930s, 1938 into 1939 probably, and established a studio here and had a gallery for a brief time. And he showed with and worked with and was involved in social life with these artists, particularly with Jean Charlton and Cardin Bailey. When he came to Houston, he painted paintings in this style, which are very nice. This is called Mexican Boy. He had been in Mexico before. Of course, the paintings that he's famous for are paintings like the one on the lower right, which are his visionary paintings, which happened after the war and after a very traumatic experience that he had during the war. He was here in Houston for a few years, part of this Cherry-McNeill Group. Another artist who was part of this group, briefly, he was from New Orleans, but spent time in China and then came to Houston and then went to Mexico, is Russell Davis. These and a couple of others are the only works that I know of his. There have to be more because he was a prolific artist for a long time, even prolific during his time in Houston. But these are in a private collection that belonged to a woman whose grandmother was a friend of these people and collected lots of their work and has some of the most wonderful things from this period. I mentioned earlier Dean Lee, pardon me, who was a classmate of Prusser and Leshkara. And here on the left is his only known work, which came out of Mrs. Cherry's estate, actually. There probably is more work. I thought at one point that he probably had died during the war because, of course, lots of people did. But then I found out that no, he lived a very long life. Hybridizer of Louisiana iris, along with his sister later on. And this is the Dean Lee Louisiana iris. The final member of this group that I'll mention has another Dallas connection. His name is Laurent Valet. And the Dallas connection, who was again somewhat younger than the older group, he was an artist, a set designer, and a window trimmer, as it says, because he did do windows for a department store here in Houston. The Dallas connection is that after an ill-fated residence in Los Angeles, he came back to, after the Second World War, he came back to Texas and located in Dallas where his mother had moved. And his only known work, I have to say that all too often for this group of people because their work, as I said, it probably exists in closets, but it hasn't come out yet, is in the Dallas Museum of Art collection. It's this work on the left here, which is a collage. I wasn't able to get a color image of it, so I have no idea, what the color quality is. But it's interesting that for one of our important Dallas artists, and he was important, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. The only known work is in Dallas. Lucky y'all. Okay, now. Let me see. My next slide is to check the time, and I have a few minutes left, which I'll use to refer to what to talk a little bit about what I'm calling the Houston eccentric modernists, and I'm basing that description of them. And this is an eccentricity with a definite queer inflection, which is an important characteristic of the group because of the sense of difference that it brought to them as a group, and that was reinforced by their interactions with each other. And I'm basing this is ongoing research, by the way. It's happening as I speak practically, and as the pandemic opens archives, because I just a couple of weeks ago got some incredibly important for my research materials from the Harry Ransom Center, which I requested a year and a half ago, but of course they've been closed. But I'm basing this research off of a recent book by a woman named Tirza Latimer. It's a fabulous book which talks about an approach to modernism in the 30s and even earlier and a little bit later, which was very nationally and internationally, even in Europe. Gertrude Stein was a part of this movement that she's talking about, Latimer's talking about, which was virtually swamped and forgotten by abstract expressionism. And it was swamped and forgotten because abstract expressionism swamped everything, but also I think there's a plausible argument to be made that it was swamped because it was so queer inflected that it became difficult or repugnant for for lots of people, including people like Clement Greenberg, to accept it as an important or even an art movement worth looking at. And the basis of the eccentric part of modernism is that the modernists were not looking to build modernism based on nationalism, but rather that they were looking at a modernism based on a deviation from social norms. And I've included this little quote from Edith Wharton, Age of Innocence, because of the long-haired men and short-haired women phenomenon, which this sort of caricatures was really a phenomenon that made people uncomfortable in the early 20th century. The hair length was not always necessarily the thing that was the difference, however.
That's not one of them, yeah.
The difference in terms of gender role expectations. Now, I said that the movement had been swamped and virtually forgotten. It's getting recently is getting a lot of attention, especially in New York. There, just before the pandemic and into the pandemic, there were a series of exhibitions that look at this group, the group of people that on a national level, international level, that were involved in this sort of eccentric modernism. Lincoln Kirsten's modern. Lincoln Kirsten, of course, most people have heard of him. He was very much a part of the groups. Other points of view at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art. Nick Moss Transmissions talks about the same group of people and the way what they were doing has been transmitted mostly through dance. This was at the Whitney. And most important for our discussion, the Young and Evil exhibition at David Zwerner Gallery, which is a private gallery that does incredible museum quality exhibitions. And I say that that's the most important reference because the Young and Evil refers to a novel that was published in 1933 that was the first novel to explicitly focus on the bohemian, i.e. gay life in the 20s and 30s. It was written by this collaboration between two men, Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler. Both of them were Southern boys, it turns out. Parker Tyler was from New Orleans originally, and Charles Henry Ford was a Mississippi man who actually spent time in San Antonio as a child. His father was a salesman, and he relocated for a brief period to San Antonio. But they both went to New York around 1930, before, after a few years. And their novel was so explicit, shall we say, that they couldn't find a publisher in New York. So they finally did find a publisher in Paris. So it came out. The connection from Houston to that group is through a woman named Wilma Crittenden, who grew up in the Heights, was a poet and a newspaper woman who went to New York, became involved in that bohemian life, and was back and forth between New York and Houston often. And this newspaper clip on the lower right talks about how she came back at that point in 1930 because the first three men she met offered her their lipstick and commented on her gowns. Now, that would not have been a problem for Wilma, as it turns out, but it made good newspaper copy. So anyway, Wilma was a very good friend of Parker Tyler. And during one of her trips back to Houston in 1937-38, she wrote Parker Tyler a letter, which is up here on the upper left. And that's one of the things that I just received from the HRC. And she talks about, says to Parker Tyler, you are a sort of magical god to several boys here. Lauren Valet, so that's how he was the entree into this whole line of research. Bill Hart, who's here on the right, Carden Bailey, who is a dream walking. I think she was quite smitten with Carden Bailey, and Albert Horrock, who was an actor, because this group was not just a group of artists, it was a group of artists in the larger sense, writers, actors, ballet people. And so, as Wilma says, they live for the time they will touch your hand and say hello. Now, that's very poetic, of course, but Lauren Valet took it somewhat literally because he sent a pencil portrait of himself to Parker Tyler, and this is a picture of Parker Tyler holding Lauren Valet's pencil portrait. And the inscription is, Parker, here is my hand. Let us both be less lonely. Lauren Valet, 1938. Now, this is getting a little far away from art. Lauren Valet, by the way, did painting, but he also did carving. Here he is doing one of his carvings. I've probably seen those. I don't know that he signed them, so I've probably seen some of those and didn't know what they were. But this is important because it indicates that this group of artists in Houston, artists, writers, theater people, were extremely well aware of the phenomena that was happening in New York with this larger, more national group of artists who were creating a distinctive sort of modernism, including Lincoln Kirsten, who we all know for founding the New York City Ballet. He did lots of other things, of course, but here is his portrait on the left by Pavel Chelachu, who was the life partner of Charles Henry Ford. But Houston also had its own ballet historian, Bennett Black, who's on the left in Carden Bailey's portrait. And in fact, this Carden Bailey painting of the ballet is drawing on the same inspirations that Paul Cadmus was drawing on, as he did in terms of spirit, not in terms of subject matter, of course, as he did ballet costumes for Lincoln Kirsten's ballets. And our group here in Houston had a dance and kindred subjects exhibition in 1939, based on that interest in ballet and performance. And performance was so important because it was possible through performance to be and to express parts of yourself that you probably were not at liberty to express in terms of the society you lived in, especially if you lived in Houston in the 1930s, but even if you lived in New York in the 1930s. So by being involved in performance and theater, you could express those things. We've got works here by Carden Bailey and Jean Charlton, and this is a Forrest Bess, because he was part of that group also. A puppet show by a woman named Olmsted. Charlton was very much involved also, and drawing his inspiration for a painting on the upper right of ballet from a newspaper, from a publicity photograph, just as Picasso had done from newspaper publicity photographs for this painting, which actually includes Picasso's first wife right here. So that's her, but obviously, he's drawing it straight from the photograph. This phenomenon in New York it's called neo-romantic phenomenon, and it bases its art on the figure much more certainly than abstract expressionism did. The painting here by Pavel Chelachev, who I said was the life partner of Charles Henry Ford at the time, and for many years was the most popular painting in the MoMA collection. Obviously, that time faded with the late 40s and 50s and abstract expressionism, though the painting is now being taken out of storage, as we can hope many of these paintings will be. Just as the New York group had its pajama group, which was Paul Cadmus, Jared French, and Margaret French, who had their beach scenes, we had our sort of similar bohemian group with Carden Bailey, Zoe Leger, who was a playwright, Carden Bailey, that's Jean Charlton, pardon me, Carden Bailey, Nyon Carlson, and Bill Hart that we showed before. Now, the Houston people obviously wore more clothes than those New Yorkers did. But, another Dallas connection of this group is through Margo Jones, who y'all will know because of her fabulous theater work in Dallas, and in fact, the SMU Theater named for her, but she actually got her start here in Houston in theater. And she roped all of these artists into doing her sets in costumes. Lauren Valet did lots of set designs for her, including this one, but also Jean Charlton and Carden Bailey did. Nyon Carlson did many of her productions for her. And so that's another important Dallas connection, but also exemplifies that theater aspect. These are photos of Margo Jones, obviously. And this William Goyen, who was a novelist, but also involved in that group, and Gertrude Barnstone, some of you may know her, who just died a couple of years ago. So a direct connection, even in her, all these years later, to that group. Now, we explored some of that aspect in an exhibition a few years ago at University of Houston downtown called Left Bank on the Bayou. These are installation shots from that show. Okay, now I'm over time, and so this is really the end. This is, as I said, ongoing research. So hopefully the exhibition, which looks at Dallas and Houston modernism, will happen next year, and we'll be able to invite y'all all down to Houston to see it. If not, at least you've seen the hope that we had here in the presentation. And if anybody is not part of the HETAG group and would like to be on the email list, just email me at this address.